About 250 years ago, there lived a man named John Murray. He and his wife Eliza lived in England, and they were very, very religious people. They went to church every Sunday, and many times John would give the sermon. Now, their church was not a very happy place, however. It was a place where they talked about a lot of people going to hell, and so you would guess that it wasn't a very happy place, and religion was serious business, and people were expected to be serious. So there was no joviality in that church. But one day they learned about another minister named James Raleigh, and they said that in his church people were happy. And it was an uplifting church, and there wasn't any talk about people spending eternity in hell. And so John and Eliza, after thinking about that for a while, they decided to go to James Raleigh's church just to check him out. Well, they went and they discovered that people were happy there. And they would joke around and they would smile and they would laugh. And when the minister, Reverend Raleigh, stood up to preach, he preached a sermon on universal salvation, saying that everybody was eventually going to make it to heaven, and isn't that wonderful? And so, of course, James Raleigh was a Universalist, and after John and Eliza heard him speak, they decided that they were Universalists as well. And so, what a wonderful thing for them. James Raleigh was a Methodist. He was part of the Methodist movement that was spreading across England in the 18th century. That, of course, was led by John Wesley, who was a minister in the Church of England. Now, when they learned that John Murray and that he and his wife had gone to James Raleigh's church, it didn't sit well with the congregation. And so one of them asked John, "Have you and your wife been going to hear that heretic James Raleigh?" "Yeah, we have." "And do you believe that nonsense that everybody eventually is going to be saved?" "Yeah, we believe that." And so he said, "Well, you can't say that." And John Murray says, "Well, I must say that. It's such good news." "Well, you can't say that." And John said, "Well, I will say it." And unfortunately, that person who represented the church said, "Well, you can't say that in this church, so you and your wife have to leave our congregation." Well, poor John and Eliza Murray, none of their friends would talk with them, and they were very lonely and sad. But then they had a baby, and they were happy for a while, because the baby got sick, and then Eliza got sick, and John Murray spent a lot of money bringing in doctors, and he borrowed a lot of money, all to no avail. His wife and child died anyway. So there John Murray, well, actually he was then, because he couldn't pay his debts, he was arrested and put in debtor's prison. And so there John Murray sat in prison with no job, no money, no family, and no friends. And he decided that he had failed God, he failed his family, he failed himself. And he decided that he was never ever going to be involved in a church again, and he was never ever going to preach again, ever. So after a few days, though, Eliza's brother, John's brother-in-law, came and bailed him out, paid the money he owed so he could get out of prison. But John was not happy in England anymore. He wanted to start a new life. And so he decided that he would head for the American colonies, and figured that would be a good opportunity to start over. And so he bought a ticket on the ship called Hand in Hand and headed across the Atlantic Ocean. And they were headed toward New York City, but the wind blew them off course, and they ended up on the New Jersey shore, stuck on a sandbar along the New Jersey shore. And there they were. And the sailors weren't able to get the ship off of the sandbar because the east wind was holding them on the shore. And because they didn't have a lot of food on the ship, after the long journey, John decided he would go ashore and see if he could rustle up some food. Well, he met a man named Thomas Potter, who invited him into his home and gave him dinner. And I would just mention that the area of the shore was Barnegat Bay, and it was close to Good Luck, New Jersey. Now, Thomas Potter also believed in a loving God. In fact, 10 years before, he had built a chapel, and he'd been praying that God would send a minister to preach the good news of universal salvation in his chapel. And he had been waiting for a long time, and finally the preacher had arrived. But John Murray didn't want to preach, and he said, "I'm not going to preach." I said I would never ever do it again. But then Thomas Potter talked with him and cajoled him and tried to convince him. He said, "No, I've told myself, committed myself, that I would never ever going to preach again." But then Thomas Potter said, "Okay, I believe that the wind that is blowing and keeping that ship on the shore is the breath of God. And I believe it will not stop blowing until you have agreed to preach in my chapel. And so if it's still blowing this Sunday, will you consider that a message from God that you are to preach again?" And John Murray thought hard and long, because he remembered the last time that he had been involved in a church that didn't turn out well at all. And so after thinking about it for a long time, he said, "Yes, I will consider it God's will that I preach if the wind is still blowing on Sunday." And it was far enough ahead of time, he apparently thought he was safe. Well, the wind kept blowing and blowing and blowing. It kept holding the ship on the shore. And so on Sunday morning, the 30th day of September 1770, John Murray went to church. He went to Thomas Potter's chapel, and he preached. He preached about universal salvation. He preached about the love of God. And he preached that everybody would eventually go to heaven. And his sermon lasted, I understand, about an hour and 45 minutes. So if you ever think the minister gets a little windy here, you can maybe remember John Murray, who spoke about an hour and 45 minutes. At the end of the sermon, somebody came in from the ship and said, "The wind has changed. The ship has been freed, and we're leaving soon for New York City." Well, John Murray decided not to leave with that ship. And after his sermon, when the people came up and thanked him for his message, he decided that he would get involved in a church again and that he would preach again. John Murray decided that it wasn't merely good luck that they had arrived in Good Luck, New Jersey, but he decided that's exactly where God wanted them to arrive. So he stayed with Thomas Potter for a while, and he preached a few more times in his chapel. And he did go on to regularly preach Universalism. And he worked closely with the Quakers and the Baptists in spreading the teaching of Universalism throughout the American colonies. And in 1779, John Murray became the first, in Gloucester, Massachusetts, he became the first minister of a Universalist church in America. Now, a few years ago, I had the privilege, Darlene and I went to Gloucester, Massachusetts. I had the privilege of preaching in that church. What an honor it was for me to stand in that pulpit and to echo the words of John Murray that he had spoken so long ago. It was under Murray's leadership that the Universalist Church in America was organized, and he is sometimes referred to as the father of American Universalism. John Murray died in 1815 after spending 45 years preaching and teaching about Universalism in the American colonies, or actually it's in the states at that point. But anyway, John Murray's roots grew into something rather magnificent. In other words, it grew into the Universalist Church in America, and they grew rapidly to having several 100,000 members by the middle of the 19th century. And of course, they became a part of the Unitarian Universalist Association in 1961. But how about Thomas Potter? Who is he? And how did he come to believe in Universalism? Well, he was an illiterate farmer. He was born in 1689 in southern New Jersey. And so he was a lot older than John Murray when they met. John Murray was only 28 years old, but Thomas Potter was 81 years of age. Now, 81 years of age doesn't sound nearly as old as it used to when I was a lot younger. But as I approach that age myself, I think, that's really not that old. But back then it would have been considered really old, because the life expectancy was only 36 years of age. And so many people considered a miracle that the wind kept the ship, the hand in hand, on the shore until John Murray preached that famous sermon in Thomas Potter's chapel. But perhaps it's an equally great miracle that Thomas Potter lived long enough for John Murray to come to preach in his chapel. So where did Thomas Potter's Universalist faith come from? Well, the answer to that revolves around a group called the Rogerines. There was a Christian religious sect that was formed by the Rogers family, a family named Rogers, in somewhere in New London, Connecticut, and it was formed in about 1674. And so it never ever grew into a very large group, perhaps several hundred people at the most, but they were a fairly influential group. And when they came to believe in universalism or universal salvation, they didn't keep it to themselves. They told everybody. You see, if they had kept it to themselves, it would not have been a problem. But because they spread the word so freely, they started to become persecuted by the dominant group of the Puritans. And so because of their persecution, they decided, well, they needed to leave Connecticut because they weren't welcome there. And so they migrated to New Jersey, where the Potter family lived. And that had a great influence on Thomas Potter. So Thomas Potter became a believer in Universalism. But the question is, what could he do? He was an illiterate farmer, and so it seemed that it didn't really make too much sense for him to become a preacher because he couldn't even read and write. But he, as a farmer, had learned how to build buildings. So he decided he was going to build a chapel and then to pray that somebody would come to preach the good news of Universalism in his chapel. And so I can imagine, though he wasn't particularly popular in that endeavor, he was about 70 years old when he began to build his chapel. And when people realized what he was doing, he was building a church of all things. They said, "You old fool, what are you thinking about? You don't have a congregation, you don't have a preacher." But I can imagine he would have said, "You will see, someday somebody is going to come and preach in this chapel." If you're familiar with the movie Field of Dreams, you know that a message came to a farmer. The message was, "Build it and he will come." Well, the message, he came to realize that the message was that he was to build a baseball field. And he believed that someone was going to come back, perhaps Shoeless Joe Jackson, an earlier great baseball player, somebody who had died long ago, that he would come back to play in his baseball field. Well, as it turned out, it wasn't Shoeless Joe Jackson, but it turned out that the farmer's father, his deceased father that was estranged from his son, was to come back to play ball in his field to be reconciled with his son. So Thomas Potter was the original Field of Dreams, if you will, or Chapel of Dreams. He believed in build it and he will come. And even at 81 years of age, he still believed that he would come. And when John Murray showed up at his door, he said, "Welcome, I've been expecting you." Unfortunately, Thomas Potter didn't live too long after that. He died in 1777. He didn't live long enough to witness the formation of the Universalist Church in America and its rapid growth into the 19th century. But I'm sure he had great satisfaction in knowing that he had built it. He had built a chapel, and that he had been faithful in praying and waiting for the preacher to come, and he indeed had come. So that was the beginning of something really, really wonderful in our relatively modern era of our country and of the world. But it seems to me that that started us back to the way it was at the time of the early church. You're perhaps aware that during the time of the early church, the Christians commonly believed in universalism. There wasn't much talk about eternal damnation in those early years, Some fundamentalists will say, well, we need to go back and reestablish the way it was during the time of the early church because they think that everybody was a fundamentalist then. No, they weren't. The Christians in the early church believed in universalism. And they were not persecuted like John Murray was and others. And it was abolished, though, in the 6th century. And so for many, many years, the teaching was not well received in the church and people were persecuted. But then along came groups like the Rogerines, and the Moravians were perhaps the most significant group before the Universalist Church in America was formed. And so it grew into hundreds of thousands of members by the middle of the 19th century. So because of the success of the Universalist Church in America, people are generally not persecuted for believing in universalism anymore. There are some churches that still will expel members who come to believe in universalism. I've known some of those people personally who have been expelled. But things are changing. And so in my own personal ministry, it's been well known throughout my whole ministry that I believe in universalism. And I've been able to continue to serve United Methodist churches in Iowa in spite of the fact that I believe in universalism. And it's become more acceptable in a lot of other denominations like Presbyterian and Lutheran and Episcopal and United Church of Christ and some others as well. So things have changed very, very dramatically in the last 200 years, basically. And that was largely because of the influence of the Universalist Church in America. Other things that have been changing that reflect the powerful change that's going on in the thinking of people is that in the last 20-some years, there's been at least 50, I'm aware of at least 50 books that have been written on the subject of universalism. While in the 100 years before that, there was only like 3 or 4 books. 100 years, 3 or 4 books written on universalism. In the last little over 20 years, more than 50 books have been written on universalism. And besides, there's a lot of websites that have been developed specifically for the purpose of promoting universalism, hundreds literally. And now these days it's podcasts. Everybody has a podcast. And I'm aware of a bunch of podcasts that have been developed specifically for the purpose of promoting the teaching of universalism. So things have really been changing very, very dramatically and rapidly. And we're going back to the way it was during the time of the early church, when it was widely accepted that everybody would make it to heaven. And so we're in a powerful movement that is going on today. And so it's not just a Christian movement. One example of a non-Christian, typical non-Christian belief is the belief in reincarnation. And so you see, the belief in reincarnation is that everybody keeps coming back to subsequent lives, and they continue to learn and grow with each time, and eventually everybody makes it. Everybody eventually goes to nirvana, or if you think in terms of what a lot of us would use, the term heaven. And so everybody who believes in reincarnation is a universalist. That's a lot of people. In fact, the people who are familiar with reincarnation say that about half of the people in the world today believe in reincarnation. Half of the people. That's 4 billion people believe in reincarnation, more or less, that believe in reincarnation. That's a lot. And and beyond that, anybody who rejects the idea of eternal damnation is a part of the movement. You see, there are people who may not even believe in God. They may not believe in life after death, but they at least reject the idea that a lot of people are going to go to hell to be punished forever. And so that's the most important thing, is to reject the idea of a God of eternal damnation. And so there's all these people, regardless of what their religious beliefs might be or lack thereof, they're a part of the movement of universalism. So the good news is that it's a much larger movement than we might realize. There's a lot of us, and it's billions of people and continuing to grow as well. And one of the reasons for our optimism for the future is that we believe in the power of love and the preciousness of each individual. And because of that, we reject the idea that a lot of people deserve to be tortured in hell forever because they're so bad. I mean, give me a break. That is the most awful teaching that anybody has ever come up with. But anyway, so we believe, though, that by the power of love, everybody can be restored and everybody can be transformed and redeemed. And that's all because of the power of love. And we believe in the preciousness of each individual. And reflective of the size of the movement, we've accomplished a lot already. And it's not just Universalists, but Universalists working with Unitarians and a lot of other people of a positive spirit. We've accomplished a lot, like the abolition of slavery. That was a big deal for those early Universalists to oppose slavery. There's the civil rights movement and working for the rights of women. The establishment of democracies and democratic principles in countless organizations in not only countries, but organizations including churches and fellowships. And with the size of our movement, just think what we can accomplish in the future and will accomplish in the future. And sometimes things look pretty bleak, and today is the time, or now is the time when we have our challenges ahead of us. But we can accomplish a lot. We will continue to challenge the belief that anyone will be tortured in hell forever, and we will conduct uplifting and inspirational services and promoting positive and hopeful spirituality. We'll work to overcome racism and bigotry wherever they exist. We'll work to promote positive and healthy relationships in our families and communities and around the world. We'll stand for the freedom and the rights of everyone, and we will sustain our planet. And so we Universalists are a part of a wonderful and a powerful and a positive spiritual movement. We've accomplished a lot already, and we have great plans for the future, and we have only just begun. Amen.